What did you determine the cause of death to be?
We ruled her cause of death to be asphyxia.
What did you determine her manner of death to be?
We determined her manner of death to be homicide.
And when you use the term homicide, can you talk about what that means in relation to your office?
Sure. It is different from, for example, how lawyers or police might use that term. For us, homicide is a vital records determination that we make. In this case, we didn't sign the death certificate, but that's the way we use the term. It's a determination of the circumstances surrounding the death, and it means to us that another person was involved in that person's death. It does not imply intent, although it does not exclude it either.
And when we talk about asphyxia, can you tell the jury what you mean by the term asphyxia?
Asphyxia means that the person was unable to get enough oxygen.
Can there be a number of causes or different means by which asphyxia can occur?
Yes,
Can you talk about some of those?
sure. You can have asphyxia can result from anything that occludes the airway, either externally or internally. So, smothering of any type, anything that blocks the mouth and nose could lead to asphyxia. Choking, anything that blocks the airway internally, whether it's food or something stuffed in someone's mouth or whatever, maybe all of those things can lead to asphyxia. Asphyxia can also result from drowning. Drowning is technically a form of asphyxia. You can also have asphyxial deaths that result from chemical asphyxiants. Carbon monoxide is one of those. Cyanide is another that impair your body's ability to release oxygen to tissues, and so they don't get enough oxygen.
And you talked a little bit about the process of an autopsy already. Any other obvious injuries that would have been the cause of her death?
The only that would be the cause of her death, no.
Can you walk us through how you ended up reaching your conclusion that this was the cause of death was asphyxiation?
Sure. So as I was just asked, we didn't find any traumatic injury that would explain her death. We also didn't find any natural disease that would explain her death. Her heart was completely normal. Her lungs were normal, except for some fluid buildup in them. Her liver, kidneys, all of her organs were normal. And so we did not identify an anatomic or pathologic explanation for her death. She did have the only real finding she had, apart from, no lethal trauma and no significant natural disease, was some bruising on her arms and one bruise on her chest. And then when we get to that point, essentially no findings that will explain the death directly, then there are a limited number of things that can explain a death in that context. One is asphyxia. Obviously, that's what we ruled it to be. And that can be, any number of things that, as I discussed, that can lead to asphyxia. But in this case, we believe primarily was related to some form of suffocation. But other things that can lead to death in that context that leave no findings for us to see would be things like seizures. There are inherited and even acquired forms of heart rhythm disturbances that can lead to a sudden death with nothing for us to see at autopsy. And then obviously drug intoxications don't leave anything for us to see. She did have, as I said, some fluid in her lungs. That's a very common finding in the setting of drug deaths. And one of the reasons that we spent a lot of time trying to evaluate for intoxicants that might possibly have led to her death.
And if we break that down a little bit, and I don't know if you use this term, but negative autopsy. Can you explain what a negative autopsy is?
Yeah, essentially what I was just getting at, where we don't have findings, we don't have pathology, we don't have trauma that explains death. We have a essentially normal a person with normal anatomy um, uh, who who has died.
And so in this case, when we talk about it being a negative autopsy, is that because there was not a clear way to determine the cause of death right away?
Yes,
And you talked about one of the other potentials when you're dealing with a negative autopsy as being seizures. Is that correct?
yes,
Can you explain a little bit about what a seizure is?
sure. A seizure is a manifestation externally in some fashion of abnormal electrical discharges in the brain. That can be what you typically think of as a seizure, where someone goes stiff and collapses and then convulses. It can also, people can also have what are called partial seizures, where they may have, uh, movement of one part of their body, or they may have um, uh, staring spells or other things of that nature as a result of seizure activity. But it's abnormal electrical changes in the brain that result in abnormal behavior, usually associated with loss of consciousness, and also not under the person's control. They just happen.
Have you conducted autopsies before where there were signs that a seizure had occurred or there had been seizure activity?
Yes.
And where would those signs usually show up?
So there's a number of ways. Sometimes those signs show up in the body. Sometimes they show up in the medical records. There's a variety of ways that we have to, evaluate the role of seizures in a death. In from a historical standpoint, if somebody has a history of epilepsy, then obviously that can contribute. But looking at a the person's body, the main things that we might see would be things that you would expect: trauma to the person's tongue, for example, and that can be recent or old. Um, and then evidence of incontinence of either bowel or bladder. Those would be the primary two main physical findings that we might see, but certainly people with seizures are known to die suddenly and unexpectedly in the absence of having had a recent seizure. Having seizures, having a diagnosis of epilepsy puts you at risk for sudden death. And so it's not, certainly we don't have to have those things if someone has a well-established history to attribute their death to a seizure disorder or epilepsy. But in the absence of significant history and the absence of anatomic findings, we don't generally are not going to call a death as seizure related. And it's also not uncommon for people to have seizures as a terminal event. If, for example, you have a heart attack and your heart's not beating normally, and your brain's not getting enough oxygen, you may seize. Or if you're diabetic and hypoglycemic, you may seize, but that's not because you have seizures. It's because of some other condition contributing to that.
During Tammy's autopsy, did you find any physical signs of seizure activity?
We did not.
And you reviewed Tammy's medical records, is that correct?
Yes,
Any signs of seizure activity in her medical records?
there's no mention.
In your experience, would it be uncommon for someone Tammy's age to have all of a sudden developed seizures?
It would be very unlikely.
And do you know how old she was?
49 at the time of her death.
Do you recall reviewing some information provided by Chad Daybell to the coroner or a deputy about Tammy having seizures?
I reviewed some records from the coroner, yes, that mentioned that he had said she had had some shaking spells or fits or something. I don't recall the exact verbiage, but something that suggested that, yes.
Did you find anything to support that Tammy had had seizures in your review of her medical records and or the autopsy?
No.
And I think you mentioned, I may say this wrong, but arrhythmia.
Yes. Mhm.
Can you explain a little bit about what arrhythmia would be or arrhythmia irregularities?
Sure. Your heart, in addition to being a pump, is also a very electrically dependent organ. Your heart's normal pumping function is dependent on electrical impulses traveling in a normal way through the heart. And those electrical impulses happen the way they do because there are what are called ion channels that open and close and allow electrolytes to move through the heart and propagate those impulses. There are both inherited disorders of those channels as well as acquired things. Those channels can be impacted by certain medications and other things that put people at risk of sudden death by prolonging their what's called their QT interval. Um, and so they having either of those, either something acquired because of medication or something that has been inherited, would put a person at risk of sudden death.
And when you looked at Tammy's heart, did you see anything that showed irregularities?
No, in those settings, most of the time the heart is going to look normal. And so we don't, we would, in any of those settings, we would not expect to see anything abnormal with the heart grossly. Just to look at it, it would look normal. But we also would not expect to see, again, that type of condition manifest itself at that at her age without some other. If she had, certainly she could have it as an acquired condition at her age. If she had, for example, methadone is very commonly known to do that, but she didn't have any methadone in her system. There are a long list of other medications that can do that. Fluoxetine, which she was on, is also rarely been described as doing that, but she had been on a very stable dose for a very long time and with no indication that that had been a problem for her.
So similar to this sudden onset of seizures, you wouldn't expect to see the cardiac arrhythmia come into play with someone at 49 years old?
Judge, I'm going to object at this point. That's a bit leading.
Sustained.
Would you expect to see the cardiac arrhythmia come into play suddenly in someone 49 years old?
Judge, objection. Leading.
Overruled.
No.
And I believe one of the other things you talked about that could result in a negative autopsy would be some kind of an intoxicant.
Yes.
Are there sometimes signs during the autopsy that you're able to find showing that a death was caused by intoxicants?
There are things that suggest that. There are very few things that will allow that to be diagnosed at the time of autopsy. Most intoxication-related deaths at the time of the autopsy are initially certified as pending further investigation or pending toxicology results. Because there's just not anything that we see. One of the findings that is, though, very suggestive that we see not infrequently is what's called pulmonary edema, which is fluid buildup in the lungs. And that it's a non-specific thing that can result from lots of causes. We see it in drowning cases. We see it in people with heart failure. But we certainly very commonly in our patient population see it in people that overdose, especially on opiates.
When we talk about intoxicants, does that also include poisons?
Yes.
You talked about a lot of times it will be pending some additional testing if an intoxicant is suspected. Did you do some additional testing in this case?
Yes, we did.
And can you talk a little bit about let me back up. Where exactly do you obtain samples on someone that's been embalmed to have that testing done?
Yeah. So, as a rule, because someone is embalmed, part of that embalming process involves removing or at least diluting their blood with embalming fluid. So we generally don't have great blood samples to use. We will collect fluid from the vessels that is generally would be a mixture of blood and embalming fluid to test if we wish. But we do our primary testing usually on a tissue sample in an embalmed person, usually liver, because liver provides the best postmortem reference samples for the most number of substances.
And were those samples obtained in Tammy's case?
Yes.
What is then done with those samples?
So we then send them to the lab for analysis. We request testing for a wide variety of analytes. In this case, we tested for hundreds of different prescription, illicit, and over-the-counter medications, as well as a large number of what are called novel psychoactive substances, which are some are illicit, some are not, but they're newer drugs that are being used illicitly. We also did testing for heavy metals, did some testing for pesticides, did testing for some additional biologic toxins, plant-based toxins, and I think those are the primary things. But looked for all of those things in her samples.
Was there anything in the results that would explain her death?
No.
Was more than one agency involved in the testing?
Yes. So we had the majority of the testing was performed by National Medical Services Laboratory in Pennsylvania, which is a sort of the premier forensic toxicology lab in the country. We use them as a reference lab. They test about a third of our cases at the Utah Medical Examiner's Office. And then we also had some testing. They don't, for example, do testing for any of the plant-based toxins. They don't test for nerve agents and those kind of things. And we had those looked for specifically by the state's chemical and biological threat lab.
Would it be fair to say that this was pretty extensive toxicology testing?
Yes.
Was the reason for all the testing because it was a negative autopsy?
Yes. And driven certainly by that, as well as the circumstances surrounding her death.
And in your opinion, did the fact that Tammy was already embalmed inhibit the ability to test for those substances?
For the most part, it did not inhibit the ability to test. Some of the results we had to look at a different analyte because of potentially interfering substances from the embalming fluid. But for the most part, it did not interfere with that at all. And generally, it doesn't.
Was there anything at all from the toxicology testing that stood out to you?
I mean, the only significant positive result was the presence of her fluoxetine, which she had been prescribed for a number of years, and it was present at a non-toxic level. Beyond that, there were some, a minimal elevation of selenium, which is a heavy metal, also at a non-toxic level, but really nothing else that was significant.
And you had talked about sending out for that toxicology testing in part because of the circumstances surrounding her death, correct?
Yes.
Do you recall some of the circumstances that stood out to you?
I mean, specifically, we would probably do more extensive testing in any case where an exhumation is ordered because of potential criminal activity. So that would be the primary circumstance, if you will, that would drive that for us. Not really any necessarily specifics in this case, but because with an exhumation, you, again, like most autopsies, you really only have one chance at getting what you want and being able to test what you need to. Having that be the reason that this person is coming to you is primarily the reason we would drive that. And in conjunction with, then we get to the end of the autopsy and don't have any specific cause of death identified.
Thank you, Your Honor. And I had asked to publish, I believe states 295D. I'm going to change that to publish 295J. It's a previously admitted exhibit.
Okay, 295J previously admitted, may be published.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Christensen, as part of your review of documents provided in this case, do you recall reviewing photos that were taken at the scene of Tammy's death?
I do.
And Judge, I am flying blind here if this is being shown or not.
It is.
Thank you. Dr. Christensen, on that photo, can you see something coming out of Tammy's mouth?
Yes.
Can you describe what we're seeing there?
Yes. This is foam, essentially. It's what a manifestation of pulmonary edema. You can see running down the left side of her face what looks like blood. Pulmonary edema fluid, as it comes up, is edema fluid is just fluid that leaks into the air spaces when it normally should be contained in blood vessels. And as it leaks into the air spaces, normally there is protein and other things within those air spaces to help keep them open. And as the fluid gets in there, it mixes with that protein and creates this bubbly, frothy fluid, which can then bubble up through the airway and out the nose or the mouth, or both.
Can there be several causes of pulmonary edema, or what ultimately causes that, or is it a result from?
Yes, pulmonary edema, again, I think I said previously, is a nonspecific finding that can result from any kind of insult to the lungs. We certainly see it in asphyxial cases. We see it in drowning cases. We see it in the setting of heart failure. We see it in the setting of drug intoxications. Those are probably the primary places where we see it, although really anything that causes respiratory failure can ultimately cause pulmonary edema to manifest in this way, pneumonias and other things.
Did the presence of the pulmonary edema also play into your findings in this matter?
Yes.
And we've talked about Utah being a medical examiner system. So you yourself or another medical or forensic pathologist will respond out to a death scene in Utah, generally speaking?
In cases where the pathologist will respond to scenes where there is a homicide or suspected homicide, or in any case where we're requested to by law enforcement at the scene or our other investigators at the scene.
Do you know in Utah if someone responds out on unattended deaths?
Yes.
And is that generally someone from your office, whether an investigator or otherwise?
Yes, it's one of our investigators in most cases.
If you had seen the pulmonary edema, is this a case in which you would have had an autopsy performed?
Given the amount of information that was provided at the scene, what was relayed to me as what was shared at the scene, there's not an adequate explanation or sufficient medical history to explain her death at her age in a sudden and unexpected way without doing an autopsy examination.
I think we've gone over this a little bit, but when you did the internal part of the autopsy, did you notice, was there anything out of the ordinary in relation to Tammy's organs?
No.
Was there anything?
Except for her lungs, sorry.
And can you explain what was out of the ordinary with her lungs?
Her lungs were a little bit on the heavy side, heavier than would normally be expected, and had fluid in them. There were also changes related to her prior embalming.
Had you conducted other autopsies where pulmonary edema was present?
Yes,
Is pulmonary edema by itself actually a cause of death?
it's not.
Would it be the result of the cause of death?
Yes, it certainly could be. So if someone has pulmonary edema because they drown, drowning would be that. If they have pulmonary edema because they have heart failure, because they've had multiple heart attacks, then the underlying cause of their heart attacks would be their cause of death. But all of those kinds of things, anything, lots of different things can result in pulmonary edema.
And is pulmonary edema generally a manifestation or finding associated with asphyxiation being the cause of death?
It certainly can be, yes.
And we've talked a little bit as well about your review of the external part of Tammy's body. Do you recall that?
Yes,
And you'd referenced the only external injuries you had seen were some bruises.
that's correct.
And Your Honor, I have what's been marked as State's Exhibit 179. If I can have counsel handed a copy, and I have a courtesy copy for Your Honor, and then I would ask that the witness be handed a copy.
Very well.
And Your Honor, this exhibit is some blank diagrams. My intent is to have it handed to the witness and have him add some markings to it.
Very well.
May I have the witness handed a pen?
Thank you.
The exhibit's not yet admitted, Ms. Blake. And I understand, because if it's going to be altered, just think of when that would take place if you're offering it.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Christensen, would you mark on that diagram where the bruising was located on Tammy Daybell's body?
Yes. Okay.
Thank you. And have you marked those based on your recollection of where you observed those injuries during the autopsy?
Yes.
And Your Honor, I would move for the admission of State's Exhibit 179.
All right, the exhibit now with the markings, I think it would be appropriate for defense counsel to see what the exhibit now looks like before I ask if there's any objection. All right, Mr. Bailiff, if you'd please submit that exhibit for reference to Mr. Pryor.
Your Honor, now that counsel's been shown a copy, I would move for the admission of State's Exhibit 179.
Okay, and I apologize, I lost track. Where is the exhibit at this point? Did you retrieve it?
I have it. Would Your Honor like to see it first?
No, that's fine. I'll ask at this point. Thank you, Ms. Blake. Is there any objection to exhibit 179 being?
If it's
admitted?
being offered for demonstrative purposes, Judge, I don't have an objection.
Okay, exhibit 179 will be admitted as a demonstrative exhibit. Ms. Blake, you may inquire.
And Your Honor, I would ask permission to publish.
You may publish.
And Dr. Christensen, you can see on this exhibit, there's an R and an L that's been written in. Would you indicate what those represent?
Yes, those simply represent the right and left sides of the body. And at the bottom, I also indicated which was the front and which was the back, although that's fairly obvious.
And then it appears that there have been several dots or markings added. Could you explain what those represent?
Yes, they are not to scale, but they are representations of the locations where we identified bruises.
And on the front, there appear to be 6 dots. Is that correct?
Yes,
And then on the back of the body, 4 dots.
that's correct.
And you've already indicated they're not to scale, but can you talk about and put into the record where on the body these bruises were located?
Yes. There's one on the left upper chest, 3 over the anterior and lateral right biceps, 1 on the anterior right forearm, 1 over the anterior portion of the left biceps, 2 over the right triceps area on the back of the upper arm, and 2 on the back of the right forearm.
Did you discover any bruising on the lower extremities?
We did not.
Did you discover any bruising around the head or face area?
We did not.
And did you in fact take photos of the bruises that were observed during the autopsy?
Yes.
You talked before about the difficulty in determining the age of a bruise by simply looking at it. Is there something else that you did in this case to try to determine how recent the bruises occurred?
Yes. As I mentioned, just the visual appearance doesn't necessarily indicate to us how old a bruise is, but we can at least attempt to narrow that down somewhat by looking at the tissue in the bruise under the microscope. Blunt injuries, the body undergo a relatively orderly progression, although certainly not very time specific in a, to the minute or even to the hour sort of way. But initially, when there is an injury, you see just hemorrhage in the tissue. Then that will be followed some hours later, can be as early as 2, might be as many as 12 or even 24 hours. You will then see inflammation start to enter the area to clean up the hemorrhage. And depending on the severity of it, you may then also see what are called macrophages that come in and start to clean up some of the broken down blood cells. You may see the formation of scar tissue if it's significant, and that goes through a progression from early what are called fibroblastic cells in the area, which are just the cells that make scar tissue, which then eventually become replaced by the scar tissue itself. And that allows us, seeing what kind of changes are present in an injury can give us an indication whether this is recent, meaning minutes to hours old, whether it's hours to days old, or whether it's days to weeks or even longer old. But more specific than those sort of broad swaths of time, we can't narrow it down.
We talked about during the autopsy, photos were taken to document the injuries.
Yes.
Were photos also taken of examination done of the injuries?
Yes.
And Your Honor, I have what's been marked as States Exhibit 178 A to Q. Counsel was provided a copy today.
The series of photographs, is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor. It's a series of photographs taken during the autopsy. And I believe the witness has been handled that jump drive. I would move for the admission of State's Exhibit 178A to Q.
And there would be no objection by the defense to that exhibit, Judge.
Okay, so exhibit 178 A through Q, it's 178 is the exhibit, A through Q are individual photographs within the exhibit, and they're all admitted, Ms. Blake.
Thank you, Your Honor. I would ask to be handed that jump drive back. Your Honor, I will indicate these are graphic photos. I am going to be asking to publish them to the jury.
Very well. We'll have those published, and as I mentioned, we've had the monitors arranged so the public's not viewing those and they're not being streamed on the live stream.
Dr. Christensen, do you see that image on your monitor?
I do.
Can you tell us what we're observing here?
This is the bruise that's on her left chest.
And in this image?
This is a closer up image of the same injury.
And can you talk about, there's a little scale there. What is the purpose of putting that on the photo?
Just so we have a reference to the size of it when you get zoomed in, especially in a picture like this, sometimes you can't always tell exactly where you are or have a reference point to know what size something is. So we include a scale so we have a reference.
And in this photo, can you talk about what we're seeing?
This is an incision through that area of bruising.
And can you talk about why you did that in this particular case?
And with all of these, looking at the tissue, like I said, microscopically will give us some idea what they look like. So this is a prelude to having a sample to look at under the microscope. But it also confirms there are things, for example, certain dermatologic conditions and other things that can look like a bruise on the surface, but when you incise them, there's no evidence of hemorrhage in the tissue. So in this case, we can see that there is hemorrhage in the tissue.
And in this particular photo?
This is, again, a photo of the same area with a tissue section removed that demonstrates the hemorrhage placed into what we call a cassette. That little white plastic thing is that tissue that is placed in there is then taken and processed and turned into a microscopic slide that I can review under the microscope.
Ms. Blake, on these, would you care to identify each by the sub-exhibit letter, if you don't mind?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.
And the first one that was referenced of the chest is going to be 178A. The close-up of the chest is 178B. The first incision is 178C. And the most recent one that was referenced would be 178D with the slide showing an excision of the chest.
Thank you, Ms. Blake.
When you looked at this, what, if anything, I think you used the term hemorrhage. What, if anything, did that tell you in relation to this bruise?
That it is a bruise. Just looking at it grossly doesn't necessarily tell us much, except that there is hemorrhage there. And then seeing it under the microscope gives us further information about that.
And then moving to 178E, can
So-
you? 178E, can you tell us what we're seeing in this photo?
Yes, this is an excision of tissue of the bruise of the left biceps.
And again, in those excisions, were you able to determine anything in relation to whether that was a bruise?
It was. Yes, there's hemorrhage within the subcutaneous fat. Normally, an excision of skin will just show a layer of normal pinkish tan skin on top, and all of the fat beneath it will be a bright yellow color, like is evident in most of those sections, but there are also darker areas indicative of hemorrhage.
And then on this slide, what are we seeing here?
This is a closer up image of the same injury and same excision.
And Your Honor, we moved on to 178F.
All right.
This is 178G. Can you tell us what we're seeing in this image?
This is a photograph of the two bruises on the back of the right upper arm.
And moving to 178H, can you tell us what we're seeing in this image?
Yes, this image depicts the three bruises on the right biceps as well as two on the right forearm.
And there are some other markings there, it looks like, on the forearm in addition to those blue marks. Do you know what those marks were?
Yes, those are areas where mold had grown and we'd subsequently cleaned that off.
So those are not bruises.
They are not.
And then moving to 178J, can you tell us what we're seeing in this image?
This is a closer up image of the right biceps demonstrating the bruising there.
And 178K, can you tell us what we're seeing here?
Again, this is an excision of the tissue of the lower of the three injuries to the right biceps with the excised tissue in the cassette.
And what did that tell you when you did, when you took that excision?
Just shows us more hemorrhage in the tissues.
And did that indicate to you that those were in fact bruises?
Yes.
And 178L, can you tell us what we're seeing here?
I believe, actually, I'm not positive looking at it, whether that's the same as the last image.
And if I back up to the last image,
Yes.
if that has the letter B at the end on that white slide, does that help in reference?
Yes, this
And-
is just a close-up image of 178J, I believe, the immediately prior image.
And when we look at this one, it appears that there's more of that dark coloration. Can you explain what that would indicate?
It's just that there's hemorrhage in a larger area of tissue.
Would that be indicative of a larger bruise or a deeper bruise, or could you tell?
I mean, it's clearly both deeper and larger in terms of the area that's damaged.
And moving on to 178M. Oops. Get back to the right image here. Looking at 178M, what are we seeing here?
It's labeled L on my screen. I believe it's the right forearm with two bruises.
And going to the next one here, what are we seeing in this image?
This one is labeled M and is a closer up image of those two areas of bruising.
And those are again on the right forearm.
Yes.
And then moving to 178N, can you tell us what we're seeing here?
This is an excision through one of those two bruises on the right forearm.
And what, if anything, did this excision tell you?
Again, it confirms that it's a bruise, that there is hemorrhage in the skin and soft tissue.
And then moving to 178P.
This is an image of a bruise on the anterior forearm, right forearm.
And then moving to 178Q.
Again, a closer up image of that same bruise on the anterior right forearm.
And 178. Oh, this is marked as 178. Oh, can you tell what we're looking at here?
Yes, this is the right forearm with an excision through that area of bruising.
And that was on the front of the forearm.
Yes.
And Dr. Christensen, were you able to make any kind of a determination as to when in time those bruises may have occurred?
They all showed evidence of hemorrhage in the tissue with no evidence of any sort of inflammatory response or cleanup response. So they would have occurred sometime from minutes to hours prior to her death.
And I think you indicated, but these would have occurred prior to her death. Is that correct?
Most likely. You certainly can bruise a deceased body, but generally speaking, that's not going to occur for a very protracted period of time once circulation stops. Um, uh, Mostly the types of blunt injuries that we see in people that have already passed are more things like lacerations, where a body might be dropped or something of that nature, but it certainly could have happened right around the time of death.
And when you look at the location of those bruises in your training and experience, could they be consistent with someone being restrained?
They could be.
When you looked at Tammy's body, did you notice any signs of lividity?
Yes.
Could you explain to the jury a little bit about what lividity is?
Sure. There are a number of postmortem changes that a body undergoes after death. And lividity is one of them. It's also called livor mortis. It is pooling of the blood, which normally has been circulating through the body under pressure. Once that stops, gravity then takes over and kind of pools the blood in whatever is the most dependent portion of the body, the part closest to the ground. If a person is laying on their back, the areas where it is supported by, whatever, a bed, the floor, a chair, whatever it might be, will not demonstrate lividity, but areas around that will fill with blood, and it makes initially a sort of a reddish purple color that is where the blood is just pooling. It can change over time for a few hours. It's one of the ways we have to look at whether a body has been moved after death, for example. But if once it's there and well established, usually by 12 hours or so, it won't change anymore, and it will stay in the position it was in, or that person was in, if they stayed in it for 12 hours. If they're moved prior to that time, then it can also move to where a new position. If someone dies, for example, on their back, stays there for a couple of hours and then is rolled to their front, that blood that had started to pool on their back will then start to pool to their front. And over a period of, the next 10, 12 hours or so, depending on how long a person stays in their initial position, if you move them after 2 hours, more of that blood will redistribute than if you move them after 6 hours, than if you move them after 10 hours. And at some point, and at 12 hours is not a hard and fast thing, but at some point that lividity becomes fixed and will not change no matter what position they get moved to.
Where did you observe the lividity on Tammy's body?
It was all on her back, and because she'd been embalmed, it had changed somewhat in color. It was a little bit more gray in color, but the distribution was still very typical.
Just to clarify, does lividity allow you to determine a time of death?
It does not, no.
Can you talk a little bit about what rigor mortis is?
Sure. Rigor mortis is one of the other sort of 3 postmortem changes in the body. Lividity is one. Rigor mortis is one, and then cooling of the body is the third. But rigor mortis is a stiffening of the body that happens after death. Initially, when a person dies, they will be flaccid or just completely floppy and not show any muscular resistance. But within an hour or two, they start to become stiff. Initially, we see that in the smaller muscle groups, in the hands and the face and other places, but it will progress to involve all the muscles of the body, and will become, essentially very solid, and very difficult to move after a period of hours. And then once it's fully developed, which is somewhere, around 12 hours also, it will stay that way until the body starts to decompose. And then that, can vary dramatically depending on where the person is. If they're in a cool environment, if they're in a hot environment, if they're next to a heater, all of those kind of things can change how fast decomposition ensues. But once a person becomes fully stiff from rigor mortis, they'll stay that way until they start to decompose.
Can you determine a time of death based on rigor mortis?
So we are asked pretty much usually only in the context of court testimony to discuss times of death or how long a person might have been dead.
Judge, I'm going to object at this point. This is becoming narrative, and I've tried to be patient, but the question called for a yes or no, and we got this narrative. So I am going to object.
Dr. Christensen, can you explain how rigor mortis would play in or not play into determining a time of death?
It can help us, depending on the degree that it is present or not present, to look at, how long a person has been dead, but it's highly variable and imprecise.
And as a forensic pathologist, do you generally determine a specific time of death?
No.
Does the presence of rigor mortis allow you to narrow a time window of when someone may have passed away?
To some extent, yes.
In this case, did you learn what time Tammy's death was reported?
Excuse me, yes. My recollection that it was sometime just prior to 6 a.m.
Had you learned or heard the description with regard to the condition of Tammy's body?
My recollection is that she was described as being cold and stiff, or cool and stiff. I don't remember which, but at the time she was found.
Based on that description, would it indicate to you that rigor mortis had set in?
Yes.
You were not present on the day of Tammy's death, is that correct?
I was not.
You did not, is it fair to say you did not get the benefit of viewing her body just after the death was reported?
That's fair, yes.
So as a medical examiner and or a forensic pathologist, do you rely on external information that's provided?
Yes.
Does that external information assist in your forming an expert opinion regarding a reference to when the person may have died?
Yes.
And in this case, did you in fact gain that external information?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And were you able to come up with any kind of an estimate regarding a time of death in relation to Tammy?
Judge, I'm going to object at this point. It calls for speculation. His previous testimony confirms that. It would just be purely speculative for him to.
And Your Honor, if I may respond.
Respond, please.
He's an expert providing an expert opinion. He's already said he reviewed documents, he gathered information, he made a determination that rigor mortis would have set in given the description and information provided to him. So he's basing it off the information and forming an expert opinion.
And in response, Judge, he wasn't present at the time. He didn't observe those factors himself. He's relying on what the police have told him. And at this point, he can't make that estimation.
All right, I've considered the objection. I am going to overrule the objection, finding it's proper in the form of an expert testimony. It will be subject to cross, so you can proceed with the question again, Ms. Blake.
Thank you. Based on the information provided to you and your experience, did you form any opinion in relation to a time of death or a time window in relation to Tammy's death?
Yes,
And what did you determine?
that she had likely been dead for at least an hour or two for her body to be described as stiff, but certainly could be much more than that, many hours. But it's unlikely to have been more recent than an hour.
And you did review medical records in relation to this case, is that correct?
I did, yes.
Would someone having anemia or a past history explain a sudden death?
It would depend on the degree and the severity of anemia, but if it's not a current problem, no.
Would someone using essential oils or treating themselves with items bought at a health food store generally explain a sudden death?
No.
And we talked about those bruises and saw images of them. Did those bruises and their location play into your findings in this case?
Yes.
And again, in a negative autopsy, you looked at the other potential reasons or causes of death that could result in a negative autopsy. Is that correct?
Yes.
Based on your experience in training, did you find it to be likely that Tammy Daybell died of a seizure?
No.
Based on your training and experience, did you find it likely that Tammy Daybell died of a cardiorrhythmia?
No.
Based on your training and experience and lab results, did you find it likely that Tammy died of an intoxicant?
No.
And when we're talking about the negative autopsy, what did that leave as the cause of death?
Asphyxia.
All right, Mr. Pryor, you can cross. Can you turn on the microphone, please?
Let's do that again. Judge, by stipulation of the parties, I'll move for admission of Exhibit 102 and 103. That's Defense Exhibit 102 and 103 that represents the autopsy. And then the first one is the 26-page autopsy. 103 would contemplate the additional pictures and some analysis as well by this witness.
All right, the defense has moved for admission of Exhibit 102. Does the state have any objection to that being admitted?
Your Honor, it's my understanding that that is the autopsy report created by the Office of the Utah Medical Examiner. And if that's what it is, in addition to some lab results and other findings, the state has no objection.
Okay, so as I understand, there'd be no objection on 102 and 103. If and when those become published, if they are, Ms. Blake, if they're not what you anticipated, let me know and we'll quickly review that to make sure they are the exhibits you believe have been admitted. So those are admitted, Mr. Pryor.
Okay. And Doctor, you mentioned that you're retired as the chief, was it the chief medical examiner out of Utah?
Yes.
And that's out of Salt Lake City, is that right?
Taylorsville, but Salt Lake County, yes.
And I'm not familiar with Utah, so is that close to Salt Lake City?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. The government hub of the state of Utah, is that right? Okay. I want to talk to you a little bit about the initial cause of death reported for Tammy Daybell, and it did say pulmonary edema. Is that correct?
Yes. Mhm.
Okay. And you were able to confirm that through this autopsy as well, correct?
I was able to confirm through the autopsy that pulmonary edema was present, but
Right.
not that it was the cause of death.
Okay. Now, when we talk about pulmonary edema in this particular case, can you tell me how long would it have taken to produce the kind of pulmonary edema that you found during the autopsy?
I don't know.
There's no way to determine that.
No.
And there's also no way to determine whether it had advanced or whether it had declined. You you exhumed Tammy Daybell's body and you have to report the facts as you see the facts at the time upon the exhumation, right?
That's correct.
And at this point, you had initially indicated that you went in front of you didn't, but you were present when a hearing was held in front of a judge to make a determination as to whether or not they would have exhumed Tammy Daybell. Is that right?
That's correct.
And do you recall from your knowledge what was the reason for the exhuming the body at that time?
My recollection is it was to determine the cause of death.
Well, there had to have been some facts. You don't get to just dig somebody up.
Your Honor, counsel's testifying, move to strike.
Sustain.
There has to be a reason at the hearing to determine why you're exhuming.
Your Honor, counsel's still testifying.
Sustain.
Isn't it true, doctor, that there has to be a reason for the exhumation and not just be to re-examine findings? Is that correct?
I would assume so, yes.
Well, you were present. What was the reason given for digging Tammy Daybell's body back up?
I don't recall specifically what was presented.
Okay, so what was the purpose of you going there if you don't remember why they dug her up?
Objection, Your Honor, argumentative.
Sustain.
Do you recall whether or not there were discussions about surrounding circumstances that could have influenced a decision to exhume?
I believe there were, yes.
Okay, and those circumstances that they justified for exhuming were the death of Charles Vallow, right?
Objection, Your Honor, counsel's testifying. The witness has said he doesn't recall.
The fact is those additional circumstances that you based the reason to dig Tammy Daybell up out of the ground was because of the death of Charles Vallow.
Objection, Your Honor, counsel's misstating. This witness was not the one that requested the exhumation.
Sustain.
Do you recall whether or not there was a discussion about the death of Charles Vallow at the exhumation hearing?
I do not.
Do you recall whether there was discussion of Brandon Boudreaux as a basis for the exhumation of Tammy Daybell's body?
I also do not know.
Okay, so you don't remember any reason, is that right, for why they decided to dig a body up out of the ground? Is that-
Objection, Your Honor, argumentative, and it's asked and answered.
Sustained.
You don't have any explanation that you recall as to why they dug Tammy Daybell's body up out of the ground, do you?
Objection, Your Honor, argumentative, and asked and answered.
Overruled on that.
You don't have any,
He gets to answer though.
I think I said previously, my understanding was to determine the cause of death.
but you don't specifically remember the factors as to why they dug her up, right? That were offered to a judge?
I don't remember the specifics of the discussion.
Okay. And you don't, now, you talked a little bit about Utah, and from what I understand, you can do it by request of the family, is that right? Or you can do it by request of going in front of a judge and giving justifiable reasons as to why you would dig a body up out of the ground, right?
I believe that is the way the statute reads. Yes.
Right. And in this particular case, the family was never notified, right?
Objection, Your Honor, calls for speculation and irrelevant.
Overruled. If the witness has information he can answer. And I want to hear the answer.
To my knowledge, the family was not notified.
So in other words, then the other side of the statute is that you went in front of a judge, not you, but someone went in front of a judge and got an order to exhume her body. Is that right?
Yes.
And to your knowledge, even though you were present, you don't remember the facts that were presented as.
Objection, Your Honor, asked and answered.
Sustained.
Now, you made a comment in your autopsy that you performed. And you noted that the bruises were what are called very non-specific bruises. You remember that?
I don't recall the specifics of how I described them in the report. I'd be happy to look at it and refresh my memory, but I don't. So bruises by nature are non-specific.
Okay. And you recall testifying last April and May in another proceeding in which you, in response to a question, described the bruises as nonspecific, correct?
Yes. Mhm.
Okay. And when we're talking about nonspecific bruises, what that means isn't it true? What that means is that you can't identify the cause of those bruises. Is that correct?
A specific cause, no.
Right. In fact, you can't tell how those bruises ended up on someone's body, correct?
That's correct.
All you can tell is that the nature of those bruises and whether they're bruises, right?
And I can offer opinions about how they might have been inflicted, but
Oh.
there's a wide variety of those.
But in this particular case, you said they're nonspecific, correct?
Even non-specific bruising can have multiple potential modes of infliction, yes.
Okay. And in this case, you identified the bruises as nonspecific. We've established that,
Yes.
correct?
Mhm.
And you can't tell me how those bruises were placed on the body of Tammy Daybell, correct?
I cannot.
Or how she got those bruises.
I cannot.
And the reality is we can go back as far as 24 hours and those bruises could have been 24 hours old. Isn't that true?
Potentially, yes.
Or 12 hours true, right?
Yes.
And we can't even put a legitimate time as to when those bruises actually got, or she incurred those bruises on her body, correct?
Beyond the timeframes we've spoken of, no.
Right. And in addition, you didn't speak to any of the family members, the immediately family members about these bruises on Tammy Daybell, did you?
I did not.
You didn't talk to the family about any medical history that Tammy may have had about treating herself for bruises, did you?
I did not.
You didn't look at any of the reports or any of the medicine from the time of her arrest in which there was a notation about bruising cream that Tammy Daybell was using, did you?
Could you repeat that? I'm not sure
Did you,
what you mean.
did you see any medicine that indicated Tammy Daybell may have been treating her bruises with bruising cream?
She had a number of ointments, creams, oils, and other things at the residence, which those that were documented in photographs by the coroner, we did look up and go through.
Okay. And based on history, in speaking with the family, you weren't able to get any information about whether or not Tammy Daybell was prone to bruising, correct?
I did not speak to the family.
Okay. Did you look at any other statements by Mr. Daybell while he talked about vomiting and fainting and falling over? Do you recall looking at those factors?
I did not see statements directly from him, but he was quoted as talking to various officers and others at the scene about those things. Yes.
And that leads into my next question, is that the information you got about what Tammy Daybell reported was given to you by police officers, not necessarily statements Mr. Daybell made. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So if we recap a little bit, we don't know why we dug Tammy Daybell up out of the ground, right?
Objection, Your Honor. Counsel's testifying misstates the evidence
Stand.
and move to strike.
We got an exhumation order to take Tammy Daybell out of the ground because you were there for that, right?
We did.
Okay. You don't recall the reasons why you got the exhumation? order?
Objection, Your Honor. Asked and answered.
Sustained.
Okay. So you talked a little bit about Utah, and then you talked a little bit about Idaho and how in Idaho, it's up to a coroner to determine whether or not there's an autopsy that needs to be performed. Is that right?
Yes,
Okay. And in Utah, it may be a little different, right?
it is.
You talked a little bit about how it's not ideal to conduct an autopsy after embalming and burial. Would you agree with that?
It's certainly not ideal. Yes.
Right.
I would agree with that.
And Judge, could I, actually, I need the exhibit. And I'll get the number, Judge. I'm sorry. I think it's 179. 179. Judge, I'd like to republish Exhibit 1. Judge, I'd like to republish Exhibit 179.
You may.
Best laid plans, right? So we're looking at Exhibit 179. You recognize that those are your dots, aren't they?
They are.
So when I look at that, how many bruises are on the right arm of Tammy Daybell?
8.
And there are 3 on the front or 1 down at the bottom, right?
4 on the front and 4 on the back.
Okay. And then how many total bruises would be on the left arm?
1.
And then how many bruises up on the chest area?
1.
So you talked about asphyxiation and you made a determination that there's asphyxiation here, right?
Yes.
Okay. And what you're suggesting is that Tammy Daybell was, someone stopped her from breathing, right?
Correct.
Okay. So I guess what I'm confused about is how is someone asphyxiating Tammy Daybell if there's one person holding her arms?
Objection actually withdrawn.
You can answer.
I wasn't there, so I can't tell you the specifics.
Right. And the other question is that if someone was holding her arms down, how did bruises get on the front of the arm and on the back of the right arm?
You can have bruising on front and back from a grab.
Okay. And then that person would also at the same time be grabbing the lower part of the right arm too at the same time?
Not necessarily at the same time, no.
Okay. And then while they're asphyxiating her, they grab the left arm and there's only one little bruise on the left arm, right?
There is 1 bruise on the left biceps, yes.
And then at the same time, somebody puts something over her mouth while they're holding her arms to suffocate her, right?
It could have happened that way.
It could have, right? It's possible. It could also have happened that this wasn't asphyxiation, right?
I don't believe so, no.
Okay. You're firm on this idea that you think it's asphyxiation, right?
I do.
And that determination you made is as a result of just talking to the police and after you did this investigation, correct?
Objection, Your Honor, misstates the evidence.
Sustained.
Now, as terms of, we talked about this previously as well, but the bruising alone does not lead you to asphyxiation. Is that right?
It does not.
Okay. And the facts about other activities that may have been occurring, particularly Brandon Boudreaux and Charles Vallow, don't lead to asphyxiation either, right?
No.
Now, previously last year, you testified and there was some discussion about the 5 different levels of determination. Do you recall that?
I don't specifically, no.
Or the 5 options? I'm sorry, the 5
Oh, for
options.
5, there are 5 manners of death, yes.
Right. And I'm sorry, I gave you the wrong term. I'm apologize. I wrote the word down the wrong way. The 5 determinations. And can you go over those with me again?
Sure.
Go ahead.
On a death certificate, there are essentially in every state except New York and I think New Jersey, maybe Connecticut, there are 5 options for what the certifier of the death can list as the manner of death. Those are
Okay.
natural, accident, suicide, homicide, or undetermined, or could not be determined.
Okay. And I guess I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the undetermined one.
Okay.
And when you come up with an undetermined diagnosis, that means you don't have any reason that leads you to say this is absolutely the way this person passed away, correct?
Undetermined manner is used when you don't have enough circumstantial or investigative or autopsy findings, whatever. You don't have enough information to decide between 2 different manners. And that can be, for example, in an overdose, it could either be a suicide or it can be an accident. In this specific case, it could be, there's allegations of that her death is natural. If I believed it could be natural or it could be homicidal, then it could be undetermined because I can't really decide between those two, but I did decide between those two.
So that is a situation where if you don't have enough evidence to determine exactly why someone died, you make the determination of undetermined. Is that correct?
If you don't have enough, certainly if the cause of death is undetermined, then the manner of death will usually also be undetermined.
And that doesn't mean there was foul play. You just don't have the information to make that assessment. Would that be fair?
Yes.
So in other words, if in this situation there was insufficient evidence to determine a cause of death, it would be listed as undetermined, right?
The cause of death could be listed as undetermined, yes.
And at that point, that's a situation, like I said before, where it doesn't mean that it's homicide. It doesn't mean that there was foul play. You just don't have enough information to make that decision. Would that be fair?
It would, yes, to an extent. It's possible that it doesn't mean that there's not foul play necessarily. Like if, for example, you call it undetermined because you think it might be a homicide or a suicide and you can't decide between the two. If you call it undetermined because you can't necessarily decide between those two, means you think it's just as likely that it was as it wasn't. I can't tell.
It could
So it
also
still
be
could be, but it might not be.
it could also be a situation where there's no medical information that leads you to any conclusion as to why someone passed away, right?
It could be.
Right. And there are situations where people pass away and there's no discernible reason why that happened. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. Now, you made mention of all the medical reports that you reviewed. Which medical reports did you review?
Reviewed records from Seizures Medical Clinic, from another clinic, whatever Seizures was before it was Seizures. I forget, it had a different name. She'd also been seen at a clinic in Utah before moving back to Idaho, and we'd looked at those as well.
And those were they were just quite frankly, those were just a matter of a couple of pages, right?
Not a lot of records, no.
Right. Well, a couple of pages, right?
And more than-
Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative, asked and answered. Counsel's testifying, move to strike.
Well, it was late. It's already answered, so overruled.
Okay. And you looked at the Seizures Medical and you looked at the other medical records and you were aware that 5 years prior to Tammy Daybell's death, she was diagnosed with anemia, right?
I believe so, yes.
And you didn't talk to the family about how that anemia had been progressing on Tammy Daybell. Is that right?
I did not.
Okay. And you were also aware that Tammy Daybell was taking a form of, and I don't want to, fluoxetine.
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 Mhm.
There's a reason I'm not a doctor. Fluoxetine, and that's a form of Prozac, right?
Yes, it's
And
a
if-
generic.
And if fluoxetine is mixed with the wrong kind of other medicine, whether it's herbs or supplements or anything else, those can have significant consequences, correct?
There can be certainly drug interactions with herbal stuff. I'm not aware of any specific ones of fluoxetine with
And as
herbal
part-
remedies.
I'm sorry, Mr. Interrupting. And as part of your analysis and the testing for poisons and all of the other testing that you did, you're not really able to test for the herbals and the supplements and everything else and its interaction with fluoxetine to see if that had any impact, could you?
I think that's a two-part question. There's not really any way to test for drug interactions. You can test whether a drug is present or not, but certainly we don't have the ability to test for most herbal supplements.
Okay. And the fact that those herbal supplements, whether or not they could have an adverse impact with the fluoxetine that Tammy Daybell was taking, correct?
Don't have a way to determine that,
Right.
whether they were even present.
The heavy lungs.
I'm sorry, the heavy what?
Heavy lungs.
Oh,
The heavy
yes.
lungs. That's an unusual medical malady. Would you agree?
It's a non-specific finding.
But it could have an impact on the cause of death here, correct?
It could, yes.
Right. And you didn't take that into consideration before you made your asphyxia determination, right?
No, absolutely we did.
No, you did?
Mhm.
Okay. You testified that asphyxia is really a diagnosis of exclusion, correct?
It is.
So in other words, you look at all other possibilities, and if you can't find anything else, you go to asphyxia. Would that be fair?
If you can't find anything else more likely, yes.
Okay. Or what is if you can't find anything else? Why wouldn't you just go undetermined?
You might in some circumstances.
Okay. One of the things I want to ask you about are seizures.
Okay.
And when a person has a seizure, it's not always a result of there being some sort of physical evidence to support that, is there?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, there's a seizure can occur at any time. Any one of us could have a seizure at any time. Would you agree with that?
Mm, could and is likely are very different things.
Okay. Okay. So are you at this point saying and excluding the fact that Tammy Daybell could have had a seizure as a possible cause of this death?
No, I can't 100% exclude it. I just think it's
Okay.
very unlikely.
You think it's unlikely? Okay.
Yes, very unlikely.
In spite of the fact that Chad Daybell talked about fainting and those types of issues, you're saying that because of that, it's very unlikely there could be a seizure, correct?
That's what I believe, yes.
Okay. And you're also saying, well, let me ask you this. A seizure can happen at any time unannounced, correct?
It can.
Okay. Or there could be some instances where there's some medical proof to support a seizure, correct?
You can have a seizure, yes, because you have a tumor or an infection or other things, or you have a condition that leads to a seizure, yes.
Okay. And then we talk a little bit about arrhythmia.
Mhm.
And with arrhythmia, there isn't always an indication with arrhythmia that there's there isn't always a damaged heart or a faulty valve as a result of arrhythmia. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
In fact, arrhythmia could happen at any time. Any one of us with healthy hearts could suddenly have an arrhythmia and die, correct?
Very unlikely.
Very unlikely?
Yes, very
Okay.
unlikely.
Well, does that very unlikely change when you look at the fact that Tammy Daybell's family history had a history of heart issues? Does that change the very unlikely to likely?
Not in the context of what her heart looked like at autopsy.
Okay. And again, because her heart didn't look healthy or unhealthy, that isn't always the point, is it? Arrhythmia can occur even in the healthiest of hearts, correct?
Yes and no. Not in, there is a reason that people have arrhythmias.
Okay.
It's not always apparent by looking at the heart. The heart certainly, as I discussed previously, can look normal. And you can have arrhythmias, but there will be something wrong with it, either microscopically evident or molecularly evident.
Okay. And molecularly evident means that there's some sort of syntax that hit the heart and it suddenly just stopped working properly, right?
It would just, yeah, an arrhythmia just means no rhythm. And if your heart stops beating, you have no rhythm.
Right. And if the heart for some reason stops beating and there's some sort of arrhythmia, suddenly we get the pink foam that starts developing in these heavy lungs, right?
You certainly can, yes.
Right. And if we get a seizure, and as a result of the seizure, the heart stops beating, and then these heavy lungs start accumulating the significant amount of pink foam we found in Tammy Daybell's body, correct?
It can happen that way, yes.
And if the anemia goes undiagnosed for 5 years and she's not getting treatment, and for some reason there's insufficient oxygen to reach these heavy lungs, we could get the same result, correct?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
Not given the activities that she was described as doing. She may have been anemic, but she was not anemic to the point it would cause those kinds of problems.
All right. In regards to a time of death, What I understood you were testifying to is there's really no definitive way to determine an accurate time of death. Would that be fair?
No way to determine a very specific time of death. A range, yes. A specific time, no.
Judge, I have nothing else. Thank you.
All right. Redirect.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Christensen, you were asked a lot about the exhumation order. Do you recall that?
I do.
You were not the one requesting that, is that correct?
That's correct.
You were also asked about whether or not you spoke to Chad's kids, and you indicated no.
That's correct.
Did any of Chad's kids ever reach out to the Office of the Medical Examiner?
They did not. To my knowledge. It's possible they might have, and I was not aware of it, but they didn't reach out and ask for me.
Did anyone ever pass on information that they'd reported to the Office of the Utah Medical Examiner?
No.
So you reviewed documents you were provided from law enforcement, is that correct?
Yes,
And those documents contained statements provided by Chad Daybell?
they did.
There were no documents provided that had significant information from his kids, is that correct?
There were some about his kids, various interviews that have been conducted with their friends and things of that nature, but no, not from them directly, I don't believe.
So you don't know, you wouldn't know if the kids ever agreed to speak with law enforcement, is that correct?
I do not know.
And if Chad's kids had made statements about Tammy's health, would those have been documents that you would have requested or wanted to review?
Absolutely.
So if they weren't provided to you, would you have any reason to think that those exist?
No.
And you were asked about Utah being a little different than Idaho's system. Do you recall that question?
Yes.
Would you describe them as a little different?
There, I guess, Utah's and Idaho's death investigation systems are kind of on the opposite poles of the spectrum in the US.
And I think we talked about this, but Idaho, a coroner does not have to have any medical training, correct?
That's correct.
Whereas a forensic pathologist or medical examiner goes through years of schooling, they're a doctor.
Leading, sustained.
Your Honor, it's sustained on leading, is that correct?
It's
Because
sustained.
I think it's within the scope.
It's not outside the scope, correct?
Just for my next question, I wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, I only sustained as it being leading.
I think we talked before, but you have worked in systems where a coroner is used, correct?
Yes.
And in your experience, do coroners have to have any medical training?
No.
And to be a forensic pathologist, again, what training do you go through?
Have to have a college degree, a medical degree, and residency training in pathology, and then forensic fellowship training.
And in Utah, again, who is it that would determine if an autopsy is to be completed?
It would be done by the Office of the Medical Examiner.
So one of the individuals that has all that medical training?
Either by them or one of our investigators. And if there are questions, then they ask us.
You were asked about the 5 different, I believe, manners that can be indicated.
That's correct.
Is it common practice for the Office of the Utah Medical Examiner to look at the surrounding facts in addition to what's concluded from the autopsy?
Yes.
And I think you talked about an example of a drug overdose, that there could be several manners, even if that's the cause.
Yes.
And you were asked about a history of anemia. Can you explain what anemia is?
Anemia is when your blood count, the percentage of your blood that's made up of red blood cells, drops below normal levels. Men have a slightly higher normal range than women, but they're both in the 35 to 50% range, more or less. That percentage of your blood is made up of red blood cells that carry oxygen around your body. You can develop anemia, which is a number lower than that for a variety of reasons. It can happen from vitamin deficiencies, can happen from iron deficiency, can happen from cancers, anything that infiltrates your bone marrow. Can happen because you bleed. It's not uncommon in young women with heavy periods and things, for example, to end up being anemic because of blood loss. But it can be from traumatic blood loss as well. You can be acutely anemic because you got your arm broken and torn open in a car crash or something. All of those things can lead to anemia, but generally speaking, a progressive slow type of anemia, whether it's vitamin deficiency or something like that, is something that your body is able to compensate for to some extent, that you remain functional, though you might be fatigued or other things of that nature. But it's not, you don't have normal oxygen carrying capacity. And so if you went from living at sea level to the mountains, you might notice more of a difference than if you weren't anemic, things of that nature.
Sustained.
Is anemia treatable?
Yes, most times.
And I think you indicated you'd seen a history of Tammy having anemia maybe 5 years before her death.
I believe that's when it was documented, yes.
And if there were no other indications of anemia in her medical records, could that indicate that it was treated?
Overruled.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, we're not seeing any additional notations in medical records about anemia other than the past history. Could that indicate that the anemia was treated? And Your Honor, if I may respond,
Go ahead.
Dr. Christensen's testimony was he saw a notation of it from 5 years previous to that, and Mr. Pryor went into it on his cross-examination.
No, I'm going to rule on that. It's overruled, Mr. Pryor. You can continue.
Could that indicate that the anemia was treated?
It could. It just means that it certainly was not mentioned again as a problem.
In looking at those medical records, do you recall seeing any indication that Tammy had low blood pressure?
Her blood pressure was on the lowish side of normal, but no indication that she had a diagnosis of hypotension or low blood pressure.
Could you use the microphone, please, Mr. Pryor?
Foundation judge, I'd like to know what report he's referencing where he saw that information.
And Your Honor, my question was just about the medical records that he reviewed in general.
All right, then he should be able to specify which medical record she's
All right,
talking
Mr.
about, Judge.
Pryor, this is not an objection. It's just an argument now. Is there an objection?
There is foundation.
All right. The objection is overruled.
In the medical reports you reviewed, you didn't see any sign of low blood pressure.
I did not.
In the medical records you reviewed, did you see any signs of seizures?
No.
In the medical reports you reviewed, did you see any indication that Tammy had had a prior history of any negative drug interactions between her prescription medication and herbal remedies?
No.
And counsel asked you about the bruises on Tammy and them being labeled as not specific. Do you
Yes.
recall that?
Yes.
You indicated that sometimes you are able to form an opinion as to how those may have been inflicted. Is that correct?
I can answer hypotheticals about how they may have been inflicted. Yes.
And based on your training and experience, where those bruises were located, could they be consistent with someone being restrained?
They could be. Yes.
And you were asked a lot about those pictures and if someone was holding Tammy down and then suffocating her. Do you recall that line of questioning?
Yes. Yes.
Where the bruises were located, would it be possible for someone to have been restraining her while someone else suffocated her?
It's possible.
Based on your experience and the autopsy and your review of documents, in your opinion, is it likely that Tammy died of a seizure?
No.
Based on your training, experience, review of the records and autopsy, is it likely that Tammy Daybell died of a cardiac arrhythmia?
No.
Based on your experience, review of the documents and autopsy, is it likely Tammy Daybell died of a drug overdose or drug interaction?
No.
Based on your experience, training, review of reports on the autopsy, is it your opinion Tammy most likely or likely died of asphyxiation?
Yes.
And again, what did you determine the cause of death to be?
Asphyxia.
And what did you determine the manner of death to be?
Homicide.
I have no further questions.
All right, thank you. That did not go beyond the scope of cross. so
Judge,
I'm-
can we have a sidebar?
Yes. All right, counsel, after sidebar, the court's determined I'll allow a recross on that one narrow scope of the issue you want to discuss, Mr. Pryor, with the witness.
So, doctor, we talked about two types of medical records. One was from Seasons. I believe that was 2017. You recall that?
There was a record from 2017. Yes,
And then there was a medical record from 2019. Is that right?
there was. Mhm.
Okay, and those were the two records that you had in terms of Tammy Daybell's medical records, correct?
No, there were also records from PA Senna that she saw at Seasons. There was a record from 2016 as well as one from 2015.
Okay. And the anemia diagnosis was from what year?
I believe 2014, which was, I don't recall specifically which records that was in. We also had records from a clinic in Springville.
Okay, is it possible that the anemia was from the Seasons records of 2017?
Possible. I don't recall for sure.
Okay, so from 2017, we have one other medical record where she went in for a wrist issue, correct?
Correct.
So how do you determine whether or not she's treated for anemia if there are no other medical records other than the initial diagnosis from 2017?
Objection, Your Honor, misstates the testimony.
Overruled.
There's no mention of treatment either way.
Okay, thank you.